QuantSpeak, expert insights from quants for quants.
Welcome to QuantSpeak, a new podcast from the CQF Institute at Fitch Learning.
Hi, I'm Dan Tudball, editor of Wilmot Magazine, and this is QuantSpeak. Well, that great philosopher Nat King Cole once said, "It's all in the game." I might be misquoting that, but I can certainly say that the years that I've spent observing quantitative finance and the financial markets from afar, I have gone through various phases. At the very beginning, I really believed that I could certainly empathize with the view that there was a hard science basis for what was going on in the financial markets, and this is reality. And then a deeper realization, I guess, came along that it's a game and there are rules. The possibility that some of these rules might be arbitrary are very open for discussion. Now, at the same time, I think that given where we're at, it sometimes is easy to forget the fact that games of chance really lie very deeply at the root of a lot of the approaches that we take in terms of trying to assess and make sense and predict what's going on in the financial markets from a quantitative point of view. I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with Aaron Brown over the last 20 years. And Aaron is well known as an author. He's a senior figure in risk management, having worked at Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, Morgan Stanley, and AQR Capital Management as chief risk manager. And also at the same time, really having cut a swathe in terms of the theoretical explanation behind gambling and games of chance and so on, deeply rooted in his own experience as a professional poker player. So I'm very happy today to welcome Aaron Brown onto the podcast. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much. And just for your information, It's All in the Game was actually written by John Nance Gardner, a vice president of the United States. And I think that was the best-selling song ever written by a United States vice president. Nat King Cole did indeed record it.
Okay, really? A vice president? He was actually the vice president?
Yes. He was a very interesting guy. Not a great political figure or statesman, but did a lot of interesting things in his life.
Great. Well, I'll have to reread the lyrics and see if we get any insight into the 2024 elections from that. Thanks very much for joining. And I think that what I was trying to stumble through there in the introduction was just basically it's sometimes easy to forget that what we're dealing with essentially most of the time is a human social construct, the market, and so on. And that there are rules and that these rules develop over time. And a great analogy, perhaps, to look through the idea of games and games of chance as being a great way to better understand or have a useful perspective on the way that financial markets work, the way that we ought to risk manage, the way that we trade, and so on. So over the years, you've provided so many different perspectives in the magazine, and also through your books like The Poker Face of Wall Street and so on, which have really provided so many different ways in. I mean, one is the parallel histories between games of chance or professional games. It's probably not quite the right thing to say poker is a game of chance, which is probably something that we'll get into a bit later. But one example is the sort of parallel histories of poker and the development of financial markets and the institutions within the financial markets in America through the 19th to 20th centuries. And then there are other ways to get into it, which is probably the first one that I want to get into, is just the development of probability as we know it in the modern era now, having its root in possibly a dice game. And I will give to you the name Antoine Gombeau, and perhaps you could talk about the dice game that he was asked to arbitrate on and how that led to a correspondence which has had such a massive impact in terms of the way that we think about probability and so on.
I would like to start out, though, by saying, when people talk about, when I talk about finance being a game, and lots of other people do too, that's not as radical as an idea as people sometimes think.
No, sure.
We often use games in society. If we can't make a decision rationally, we play a game. So if we don't know if somebody is guilty of murder or not, we have a trial. And we have a trial in a court, and we use the same word court for where we have trials and where we play games. We select juries by lot. We promise you a fair trial. We don't promise you the right verdict. Elections are also games with, songs and dance and drinking. And we don't promise that the wisest or best person gets elected, but we do promise a fair, or try to deliver a fair election. And finance is the same thing. We have to agree on a price. We have to agree on a price of oil. Nobody really knows. Impossible to calculate what it should be, but we need everybody to agree on it so that all economic transactions are consistent. And so we play a game. The story of Lombard, who also, he wrote under the name Chevalier de Mer, and probably is more familiar under that name. He was actually, this was an old problem. He was not actually asked to arbitrate a specific dice game. This was an old problem.
Oh, right.
So two people are playing a game, and one person, each one picks a number. So one person, say, has 1, the other person has 6. And they roll dice until one person, either 7 1s come up or 7 6s come up. And whichever number comes up first 7 times, that person wins. So the game is interrupted, and one person has 6 numbers and the other person has 5. So one person needs 1 more roll to win. The other person needs 2 more rolls. And people had argued for a long time about how this stake should be divided. So Pierre Fermat and René Descartes exchange a series of letters that work out modern probability. And the interesting thing about this is I think the letters are not appreciated enough. It's really worth going back and reading them. I read them in translation, but
right.
Because what they really did was kind of interesting. So Pierre Fermat's a mathematician, but he took a lawyer's approach. And he said, well, if it's a tie game, obviously you divide the stake evenly. So what we have is we have a game. The next dice roll is either going to win for player A, or it's going to make it into a tie game. Well, if it wins for player A obviously is entitled to the full stake. If it's a tie game, player A is entitled to half the stake. So we really have a game. So really player A owns half a stake, and we're playing a game, a fair game, a tie game for the other half. So we split the second half. So it's 3/4 to player A and 1/4 to player B. Pierre Fermat was a lawyer, but he took a mathematical approach. He said, well, let's suppose instead of stopping after somebody wins, let's suppose we play the final 2 games, whether we need the second game or not. If player A wins the first game, we don't need the second. So let's say we do all 4, and let's assume we do both games with 4 possible outcomes. We assume all 4 are equally likely, and we see that A wins 3 and B wins 1, so A should get 3/4. And what delighted the two is when they discovered they get the same answers both ways, and that's what convinced them this was the right answer. Right. It actually held probability back for quite a while because a lot of probability for the next 50 years was done in terms of equiprobable events, that they thought you needed to break everything into equiprobable events to define probabilities. And that sort of slowed things down. And people completely forgot Fermat's argument until Fisher Black and Myron Scholes rediscovered it in their 1973 paper.
Right. Wow. So Pascal in correspondence with de Fermat, and then after that, it disappeared.
Well, people forgot the legal argument. Right. They focused on Fermat's argument of equiprobable events, and then Bernoulli managed to generalize that to, 50 years later, Bernoulli generalizes that. So we can talk about events that have unequal probability. We don't have to make everything down into atomic equal probable events. We can actually talk about distributions.
Right. So in that, I assume that it wasn't the first time that anybody had tried to analyze a game of chance, a dice throw, and so on. But this particular chain of events in terms of the correspondence and so on subsequently developed into a lot of the foundations of probability theory.
I will say, by the way, we know there were dicing guilds in medieval Europe, and we know people figured out this stuff thousands of years earlier. So people knew it, but they had no mathematical theory for it. And this was, and you know, they stumbled over problems that basically come down to what does randomness really mean, which is still something that troubles a lot of philosophers and theory. So it wasn't that they didn't know the math. I mean, one of the interesting things is Pierre Fermat and Pascal did incredibly advanced mathematics that even, you know, graduate students today have to work through carefully. But the math they used for probability is something, you know, any high school student can easily grasp and do it. And it really is conceptual, their problem. And there's a lot of very interesting work about how did people think about random? They didn't have words for it. They, you know, the word, like the word random to Shakespeare meant fast. It's only later did it sort of acquire a connotation of recklessness, of unpredictability, of randomness, you know. Hazard comes from dice. So, you know, people had real trouble. And a lot of it has to do with philosophy. You know, if you believe there's a omnipotent and, you know, God controlling everything, then what does it mean to be? You know, it's just, well, God made the dice come up 6 the same way he chose that person was going to get cancer or that person was going to get rich. So this was their issue. And it was the breakthrough was to treat this mathematically in explicit form. The empirical results were well known. I mean, people knew how to play dice.
So it was also a symptomatic thing of the Enlightenment that they are actually able to think in those terms.
Yeah, I agree. It's not dissimilar. We had something similar come up in the 1950s when people decided to, you know, use a random walk model for stocks, you know, instead of trying to predict the value of a stock based on, you know, earnings and discounting and this and that, to say, well, look, it's a random walk, it's random. And then all sorts of breakthroughs follow from that. But it's a philosophic leap. You know, for centuries, people had insisted, no, investing isn't gambling. You know, investing is something better, calculatable.
Yes, exactly. That reminds me when we were starting the magazine and I was trying to be clever and I said to Paul, should we call Aaron's column Brownian motion? And then Paul said, I think that's a really bad idea. I don't think Aaron will approve of that in any way whatsoever. So,
but by the way, there you go. There's another. Brownian motion was first analyzed by Einstein. I mean, people had noticed it. Well, Brown, a distant ancestor, probably no relation, named Brown discovered it, but it was Einstein who explained it in terms of randomness. And that, again, was a breakthrough. You know, here's physics, but he's using randomness.
The aspect of gambling and your relationship with poker, which as far as I know, has existed since your undergraduate days or possibly before. But you have written, and it's been oft said that poker and poker-like features in other games is the only theoretically interesting popular game. Before we dive into poker and its relationship, if you will, with finance, maybe you could talk a little bit about that aspect. The only theoretically interesting popular game.
I was not the one who said that. It certainly is enormously interesting theoretically. Most games, I guess, are analyzable. I mean, in principle. So chess is very complicated. And so, you know, nobody's figured out the perfect chess game yet. But basically, the problems in chess are computational. Other games, you know, checkers, you know, card games, whatever, typically you can calculate an optimal strategy if you have enough computer power. Poker, you should be able to in theory, but it is trickier in some respects for that reason. I was not attracted to poker because of its theoretical complexity, by the way. I started out treating it as a you know, as a deterministic game, which is, you know, for ABC poker, if you're playing against people who aren't very good, that's the right way to think. You know, don't worry about these subtle mathematics of bluffing and representation. You just, you know, basically play it the way you would any card game against people who aren't very good, just, you know, betting on the long run frequency, just taking every bet in your favor and turning down every bet that's not in your favor and, you know, slowly accumulating your edge. So if you make yourself the house in roulette, kind of is the idea. But I did get interested in the theory of it, and actually I was part of a generation in the 1970s that first took poker seriously and did some serious poker work. Believe it or not, every poker book up to that point was written either by bridge players who had no idea how to play poker and treated it like bridge, Or the most popular writer, probably or second, was a guy named John Scarn, who was a sleight of hand magician and just was wrong about every single thing he wrote. He was just amazingly wrong about everything, but was incredibly popular. But in the 70s, you had some overeducated people, much like me, who were sort of a little bit, adrift from society and whatever, and started thinking seriously about poker. And that's where all of the really great early poker books of the 1970s, 1980s, those poker books that really revolutionized the game. And by the way, it was mostly in California. It was the Southern California poker rooms in Gardena, California, where the theorists were. Las Vegas was completely different. Las Vegas were the leather-ass Texas road gamblers who were very shrewd, but entirely ignorant of mathematics, except for one, a guy named Sailor Roberts, who was an early World Series of Poker champion, who was actually quite smart and a very good bridge player. I used to play bridge with him all the time. We were a partnership, but he was the only one who really had much idea of the mathematics of poker. And I don't think he used it in his play.
Academically, at that point, what were you studying?
My interest was mathematical sociology. So I go to Harvard. I was really excited about going. And I said, there's all these hundreds of courses I want to take from all these really great, smart people all over the world. But I want to take all these courses. So I go and I put my schedule together and I show it to my advisor. You're assigned a freshman advisor. And he said, I can't sign this. This doesn't lead anywhere to any major. And you got graduate courses, you got, the total courses that are inappropriate for freshmen, you just can't, I won't sign it. I said, well, that doesn't, I don't like that. So I read the rules, and the rules didn't say your advisor has to sign your card. It says any faculty member can sign your card. So I picked one. The guy I most wanted to take a course from was a guy named Harrison White, who was chairman of the sociology department. He was a mathematical sociologist who did brilliant work. And so I go to him and I said, can you sign my card? And he said, what was that? I've never seen a card. I've never been an undergraduate advisor or whatever. And I said, well, the rule is any faculty member can sign it. And these are the courses I want to take, and my advisor won't sign it. And he said, well, of course you should take the courses you want to take, why not? So I signed it and I took his seminar, and I ended up taking the seminar for 4 years. And he was an incredible influence on me because he was using mathematics to solve real sociology issues. And it was just such an exciting thing. And I took a lot of economics courses, but I really got the idea that, these people are using math. They're using models, but they wouldn't bet a nickel of their own money on these outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
They're just playing some game. They're trying to get publication. They don't have the slightest interest. I worked the summer after my freshman year. I worked on the National Standby Gas Rationing Plan. So this was a really important deal. I mean, I was very low down. I was, I was one of 200
Right.
drones doing little pieces of it. But this was the document. This was going to sit in the White House, and if the U.S. had to impose gas rationing, because this was during the gas crisis, 74, 75,
Sure.
This was going to be how they were going to do it. And so it was a very detailed, thousands of pages exactly how it was going to do work. And so my job was one of my jobs was to figure out how much fuel would be needed to harvest crops, because what you didn't want to do was do gas rationing that prevented the crops from getting harvested so everybody would starve. So the first thing I had to say is, okay, well, I said, well, okay, I'm a city boy. I don't know anything about farming. Do tractors use gasoline or diesel fuel? And of course, none of these people knew or cared or thought this was important, whatever. But I thought, okay, well, it's pretty important. So I called up the Department of Agriculture, and the guy wasn't there, but there's a guy who knows this. And so I left a message, and I called Ford, because Ford makes most of the tractors in the US. And I got through to a guy. He said, oh yeah, he said 80% of the tractors are diesel and 20% are gasoline. Okay, great, thanks.
Right.
And the agriculture guy calls me back. I think, okay, well, I'll be polite and listen, because I don't want to just tell him how we're doing. He says, yeah, 20% are diesel and 80% are gasoline. And I said, oh, I think you have that backwards, right? He said, oh no, of course not. But I talked to the guy from Ford. He said, oh, that guy, he's crazy. He's talking about newly manufactured tractors. He's not talking about the stock out there. Well, that wasn't true. I went back and forth with these guys, but they just had completely different models. They wouldn't agree, and they didn't care. I mean, they weren't saying, okay, this other smart guy with all the data thinks something else. So finally, I just started calling gasoline stations in rural areas and asking, hey, how much diesel do you sell? How much gasoline do you sell? And I got some reasonable answers. It turns out, actually, by the way, the Ford guy was reasonably accurate, and then the agriculture guy was just completely off. But this hit me like, okay, this is a tiny detail that could starve the United States, and nobody seems to care. So this made me kind of disillusioned. So this is what kind of drove me to poker gambling, to saying, if this is how the world is run, I want to have a more secure source of income than hoping that, gasoline gets delivered to harvest the crops.
Yes, using probability and statistical analysis for a more direct good rather than a vague end certainly would seem appealing at that point. Did you at that point, did you see the obvious link between approaches in terms of gambling games and application within the financial markets? Had you even considered the thought that you were going to end up in the financial markets?
Well, yes and no. So we have to go back even farther. So back in the day, I was a kid, 1960s, we had things called newspapers. And the newspapers had a bunch of words in the front and they had a bunch of numbers in the back. So they had crop yields and weather data and baseball box scores and horse racing results, all these numbers. And I read them back to front. All I cared about was the numbers. And I find it interesting because if you go back today and you take the front page of a paper from 1963, say, you're going to read it, you're going to say, these people had no idea what was going on in the world. They didn't know what was important. and the stuff they did cover, they totally misunderstood. But you go in the back, and these are numbers people still use every day for data analysis, for predicting things.
Yes.
So I was right. The numbers were right, and the headlines were silly. And I would look for patterns, and I didn't care whether it was stocks or baseball games or weather. Any patterns I could find, I was just fascinated by working with and dealing with. So it never occurred to me I would specialize in any of this, right? To me, it was, okay, here's a bunch of numbers, and anytime I can figure out how to make a bet where I can use my knowledge of these patterns, I'm going to take it, and I don't really care. I mean, I'd prefer just to deal with the numbers. I don't want to know, like the names of the baseball players. I don't want to know, whether a horse is a mare or a gelding or whatever. I just want to bet on these numbers with people who are willing to bet with me.
Sorry, Aaron, that's quite to be able to abstract it to that point. Would you say that you were framing the game for yourself just in terms of the numbers and the relationships between the numbers, rather than the information, the extraneous informational stuff which had no effect? That's a really interesting way to be thinking at that age. Was that something that was just innate, or was it something that was around you at the time?
I mean, as far as I know, it was innate. I've always felt that way. I'm sure there's a psychological pathology for it, that the numbers are real and the numbers are your friend.
Right.
And what they represent is some scary sort of external reality that you'd just rather not think about. You eat a nice steak, you don't want to think about the slaughterhouse. Well, I want to bet on nice, clean, predictable numbers that I understand and like. I don't want to bet on messy people and real weather and things like that.
Sure.
Only later did I understand that, the person on the other side of the bet is actually more important than the numbers. I never did get very interested in what the numbers represented.
Right. Well, that's a good segue into the next little bit that I'd like to talk about is back to poker, and something that you've covered in our pages and in the Poker Face of Wall Street and other publications is the sort of parallel histories of the development of professional gambling arenas, poker in particular, and the sort of underpinnings of the modern financial markets. In getting ready for this conversation, it gave me an opportunity to look back at a lot of the articles that you've done over the years for us, and it was this particular one, which you might recall, Table Stakes, in which you looked at the curious evolution of poker, and that's from nearly 20 years ago now. And in there, you said that here's a direct quote: the modern economic world was born in the early 1800s in the Mississippi River Valley, but we have little documentary evidence about the birth until the 1850s. And you said that arguments about the game of poker, which was invented at the same time and place, were more subtle and disinterested than if you were to try and go back and look at discussion on finance at the time. And since poker and finance involve the same core concepts of money, expected value, and risk, we can learn about both by studying either. And poker writings are easier to understand. So in a nutshell, you're saying that that period in American history, in which we see sort of the modern roots of the modern game of poker, and the roots of a lot of the structures which exist in the financial markets in terms of clearing and all of those sorts of things, have their sort of birth in the early 1800s in the Mississippi River Valley area. So starting from there, would you like to describe this relationship and why it's such a useful way to look at the development of a lot of the underpinnings of the financial markets now, and also the thinking behind what poker reveals to us in that context?
Yeah, sure. And this is something that sort of occurred to me in graduate school in the early 1980s. And I got fascinated by it because the brief history of gambling, right? So from beginning of time, as far as we know, essentially every human culture has a lot of gambling, but it's all, face to face by individuals. There's no house. It's all peers gambling, peer-to-peer gambling. And then in early Enlightenment Europe, we start seeing professional gamblers who provide stake, who provide credit, who run the game, who take an edge, eventually becoming, the casinos. But in the United States, you said American history. This is really world history, because this is where, the financial world was born. We see something totally different. We see this emerging game, poker, that's unlike any game ever documented anywhere. Not in its card play. Its card play is like trivially simple. It's the kind of thing like a card player could come up with just, invent a quick game, with
right.
But in its betting rules, it's completely different. It has no edge. It is peer-to-peer. It is self-organized. And it has its own credit structure and its own network structure. So it's a fascinating innovation. And what's fascinating to me is nobody said, well, this guy invented it, or was first played here, or here's some precursor. It just seemed to jump whole cloth out of nowhere. And all of the early references to it, first of all, the earliest references are from about the 1830s, and the game was already well known at the time. And they're clearly misunderstood the game. They did not know the rules. They didn't know what they were describing, but everybody knew this was a game popular in the Mississippi region. And by the way, just a little technicality here. It's not just the Mississippi Valley. It's sort of all the rivers that drain into the Mississippi. So it's like a third of North America. But it was well known that everybody played it here for high stakes, but people were pretty vague about what the rules were. And then we find out, so fast forward to, about 1850, late 1840s, and the modern futures exchanges spring up. And again, totally unlike any kind of market ever done anywhere else in the world. And nobody said, well, this guy invented it, or here's how we had the idea. We don't really have a gradual development that just suddenly happened. So this says to me, okay, there was some secret that everybody in the region knew, and nobody on the outside of the region either knew it or understood it. And it's kind of the same thing with both poker and financial markets, which is why I think they're so entangled. And it happened in the same places in time. The people who built the futures exchanges were all poker players. And this innovation from the 1850s eventually grew into the modern derivative economy. It changed everything about how world economics was run. And so it puzzles me that historians are not more curious about the intellectual history of these ideas. I think part of the problem is they've become so obvious, they're so second nature to people now, that it's hard to understand why people didn't do this, in ancient times or 100 years before they actually did.
Yes.
And poker as a game is still misunderstood. People don't understand the radical difference between poker and other games.
Exactly. It's that taking for granted, which is part of the sort of motivation behind me asking you to come on and talk about games of chance, gambling, relationship to finance, because it allows that stripping away of all of the things which have developed on top of the principles and the structures that were able to be created. You're talking about the what was it that was special about that area at that time, and you can talk about livestock and the need to transport and the penetration of the railways out, and what kind of structures needed to be created in order to execute trade and so on, which, as you say, these things, some of them you can put them down to a particular person or place, but it's that conglomeration of a variety, a confluence of things coming together which create the opportunity for these things to arise. One of the interesting passages in one of the articles was your description of how the blind and double blind rule developed and what was the reason for that, and basic risk aversion, the tell that would happen if you know that a person has seen their cards before placing the bet, and so on. That just that little bit of a discussion there was, I think, a very good description of the way in which we assess risk and what are the sort of the fundamental underpinnings even behind the way that we think about why do we want blockchain, why do we want chain distributed ledgers. The thought behind it, the impetus behind it is similar. And your description of the way that blinds, double blinds, and then you could straddle and so on and so forth. And these were things that were augmented into the game and very intelligently. Is that something that you could kind of expand on a little bit or put into context for me a bit?
Sure. And that's a good example of a discussion that is explicit with poker, but it's very important for finance, but nobody seemed to discuss in any kind of clear terms in finance. So the issue is this: it was very important. One of the ways poker is different from other games is that there is I don't want to say a moral exactly. There is a code of conduct, a set of attitudes that are essential for the game that aren't, incorporated in the rules necessarily. It's part of how people think about it. And one of them from early poker was, it was very important that this wasn't a gambling game because, or at least no one ever was forced to make a bet. Nobody ever made a bet without information. People only put money in the pot voluntarily when they thought they had advantage. And the trouble with that is it made for a very boring game compared for people who wanted to gamble. And people who wanted to gamble said, okay, well, let's have an ante. Let's force everybody to make an initial bet, and then we'll have a pot, and then people will compete for the pot, so that we'll get a lot more action. Or the other system was the blind system. Says, okay, the first player or the first two players are forced to make bets. And the traditional poker players said this is anathema. This is destroying the spirit of, it's turning it into a gambling game. It's people who don't understand poker.
These would be the so-called scientific players who were complaining.
You might they might have called themselves that, but it was really a moral argument they were making.
Okay.
So anyway, but they lost. Okay, it was just too dull. It was too, rarefied without it. But the blind was better than the ante because the blind actually is both an advantage and a disadvantage. It's a disadvantage because you're forced to make a bet regardless of what your cards are. So even with weak cards, you have to make a bet. But you get an advantage in return, which is that other people in the early version of blind, people are not allowed to call your blind. They have to either raise it or fold.
Right.
And that actually equalized it. And with playing like that, there was actually an experiment when Card Club did where they recorded the gains and losses of players, with or without the blind. They found out it was pretty even. There wasn't much advantage or disadvantage to posting a blind. So it violated the spirit of poker in the sense of somebody who was forced to make a bet in order to play, but it was even out. They got an advantage for that. So you could say, well, they're buying an advantage at a fair price. So that was more acceptable to the traditionalists. So we have the same thing in finance, right? I mean, people say, well, the stock market is just a big casino. Well, what does that mean? Well, what they mean by it is the people going in there are just gambling. They're just, they're putting in bets that they don't have any information on. They're putting in money because they want to gamble, not because they think they have an advantage or an edge. And this is all, this is still today a controversial topic. Maybe people think that, well, to the extent people are just gambling, we should try to get rid of them. We should try to get rid of speculators from the markets. And it's the same, moral point, the same intellectual point that says, okay, you should only be putting in money if you think you have an advantage. And otherwise you're just gambling, and gambling is bad. So you have this, great discussion of it in poker. People wrote back and forth about it and thought very deeply about it and argued very closely. Whereas in finance, this stuff was discussed in very opaque and inconsistent terms, and it's hard to know what people really meant by what they said.
Yes, it's interesting. Well, taking a historical and archaeological approach to things, and the importance of the record, and then you have these sorts of jumps in history where you don't necessarily have any recorded material to look to. That rings a bell with me, actually, with regard to your time. What was it to do with? There was an article, it was either to do with your time during mortgage-backed securities or the value at risk sort of period time. And you were talking about something to do with the fact that a lot of the discussions happened on dial-up bulletin boards and don't exist anymore. And this was a period of, I can't remember whether it was to do with value at risk period or whether it was the mortgage-backed security period. But you'd have this black hole, and once everybody who participated is no longer in this mortal coil, that would be lost forever as to exactly what was the thinking and how did things develop. Do you recall which period that was?
Well,
dial-in bulletin boards and things like that.
Yeah, it was both. So this is the mid late 80s.
Yeah.
So we'd all been on DARPANet when we were at school. So we knew about the internet, and some of the early web type things were around, but it wasn't. It wasn't practical. Nobody had nobody had an always-on connection. You had to dial things up, and you couldn't.
Yeah.
Unless you were at a big university, you really didn't have access to servers. So really, what you did is you dialed up a phone number you knew. Typically, for most of these people, there was only one phone line in. So if you dialed up to this board and somebody else was there, then you just got a busy signal and you had to wait. And it was just a bulletin board. It was, you could post things, you could read things. So you dial up, you'd post whatever you wanted to post, you download the other posts so you could read them offline. And this is how people communicate. If you were kind of educated in science, so you had used the DARPANet in school and school bulletin boards and things like that, so you were familiar with the technology, and you fell into a group where you didn't meet face to face very often. Or here is a big thing: we were communicating with our peers at other investment banks who we weren't actually allowed to talk to. But, somebody would come up, some new product would come up,
Yes.
a new mortgage product, a new derivative. And, you work on it, figure out how to price it, but you'd want to make sure, you weren't way off. So you'd want to talk to all your opposite numbers at the different banks and say, okay, can we all agree on, here's how it's going to be priced, so we don't get, if one person makes a mistake and the firm loses millions of dollars, that's going to be a problem. Or just if people disagree, it's going to be, so let's all thrash it out, agree what the model is, kind of what people do on Bloomberg today.
Yes.
And so we'd get on these bulletin boards, but, if we had, said, okay, let's all meet at a Wall Street tavern or something and work it out, and people saw us, they would, be in jail, for price fixing or something. Certainly all fired for, it would have been chaos without it. If we hadn't done that, if everybody had come up with their own models from scratch, some people would have, been divergent and markets would have been chaotic. So really the only practical way to get things done. And you had to be one of these networks. If you weren't in one of these networks, you couldn't write models for a big investment bank because, you didn't know what everybody else was doing and you might be out of step, even if you were right in some sense. If you were off the market, you get killed. And we talked about a lot of other stuff, and anything people was working on. And so this is where the modern derivative pricing models got thrashed out, not in academic publications, not in, working papers or things like that. And this is where modern risk management got thrashed out in these things. And you said earlier that, when people shuffle off the mortal coil, unfortunately, it's worse than that. Most of the people who were on these boards are probably still alive. But we have the vaguest memory. Like people say, well, when did you first see this? Was it, 1985 or 1987? Right. I have zero recollection. You say, well, was this person the person who came up with it? I don't remember,
Yeah.
I was doing a lot of other stuff and I was reading it and I, wasn't paying attention and I didn't write down all the names of the people or keep any records of it. We didn't have a cloud, save everything, and we didn't have phones that keep things forever. So I think that region will be very difficult unless somebody can kind of physically reconstruct from some, ancient hard drives, resting away in somebody's back room or something. I think that is probably lost forever.
Yes, and unless there was somebody who has like a stack of dot matrix printouts,
which fade over time. There were Usenet groups. So by the late 80s, people were kind of moving over to Usenet groups, and the Usenet groups were saved and recorded. But the Usenet groups were much broader, is the thing. And so I think these dial-up boards, there would maybe be 20 people on one board. You couldn't have more because everybody get a busy signal all the time. And, one person had to dedicate a computer. So they were more focused and more productive, but more quicker, less junk.
Interesting. I'm jumping about a little bit, but thoughts are occurring to me. And you were saying earlier on that during the 70s, there was this sort of flourishing of thinking and theory in poker. And of course, that makes me think of Ed Thorpe in the 60s with Dealer, and obviously that's blackjack. And had that work by Thorpe, by Shin Kasuf in the 60s set a precedent that it was okay to think in a theoretical way about these games. Was that an influential factor, or was it an entirely separate development?
Well, I'll tell you, it was everybody involved in this had read and Beat the Dealer and transformed their lives. And also the work of John Kelly, which Ed Thorpe popularized.
Yes.
And I don't know, it wasn't that this made it okay for us. All of us knew it was okay all along. It was great to find that there was somebody else who admitted it and could write about it openly and not be so that was very important in that sense. But and we all were hero worshipers of Ed Thorpe, but we were different, right? So Ed Thorpe, he writes this paper and he goes to Las Vegas, he makes money in blackjack, and he writes about other casino games and beats them as well. And so he has this career and he starts a hedge fund, incredibly spectacularly successful hedge fund. But he's a mathematics professor, right? He's living a normal life. He's kind of like, he's got a Clark Kent as well as a Superman. So yes. Kents, right? We were living in this world. We were not we were not math professors. We were not, writing best-selling books. We were a community within ourselves. And who knows? Was that because society was different? I think that was mostly it. I think society was different in those days. We were baby boomers. We were, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, Rage Against the Machine kind of thing. We weren't going to get professorships, get tenure. We weren't going to, write best-selling books. We were going to go out and beat the dealer, but not tell anybody about it, or only talk about it among ourselves. There was also, by the way, a very influential, there still is, there's a triennial every 3 years. There's a conference, international conference on gambling and risk-taking. And that's where all of the people who were, all the advantage gamblers, all the people who were thinking about this stuff, they would all meet every 3 years at this at this conference. It's very unusual for an academic conference because it attracted mathematicians, it attracted economists, psychologists, casino executives, advantage gamblers, people who treated problem gamblers, and you never get an academic conference where people from that different background come together,
Wow.
really interact. And that's where, an awful lot of stuff was thrashed out as well. So that's where we kind of met and came together and exchanged ideas and so on. And that was in person. That was not dial-up boards. The dial-up boards was really only finance, at least the ones I was associated with. So some of us moved into finance, not because we were imitating Ed Thorpe, interestingly. I don't know anybody who said, hey, Ed started a hedge fund, I'm going to start a hedge fund.
Right.
It was completely like, well, here's a game where you can get a lot more money down. You kind of hit a ceiling at gambling, at managing gambling, and you just can't bet enough, or you can't get paid off enough. And so many people are just perfectly happy being free. But other people like me, we said, well, you can put a lot more money down in finance. You get 10 or 100 times of the earnings. Then you can be more respectable, right? You can tell your mother-in-law what you do. And so that was a reason for moving to finance. But we came in with the attitude like we're joining Wall Street. We came in like we're going to beat Wall Street. We're going to beat the street. And we're going to, take our gambling expertise, we're going to take all their money and then we're going to go somewhere else, when we've got all of that. No, I don't think any of us thought we would be spending 40 years on Wall Street.
Community is sort of, I think community is a theme in your writing, actually. Either observationally, you talk about communities, or also, I think to a large extent, the point that you won't go beyond is just to say that something can be a community creation in a way. I'm thinking about one thing is one of the passages from one of the articles on poker, I pulled the quote out, was poker was supposed to be a self-organized society of people, like a mining camp or a hunting party, not a gambling game dependent on bankers or casinos. A poker loss was an obligation of a different sort than wages owed or contractual payments. You mentioned earlier on as well that there's this sort of, you wouldn't call it a morality, but a code of conduct amongst poker players. And then also, for the longest time, I was communicating with you on your e-Raider email account as well. And as I understand it, the e-Raider idea was also, maybe that's something that you would like to talk a little bit about, explaining about how, because it kind of preempts the thinking behind what they call meme stocks and things like that now, as far as I kind of understand it. But as far as I understood it at that time, you were just using the available technology to communicate and organize over particular investment types and so on and so forth. But maybe you could explain that a little bit. But all of these things sort of feed together into a kind of a Aaron Brown on community aspect of things. Is there any nugget or gem in that you think you can dig out of my logorrhea there?
Sure. The idea of community, I think, first hit me in poker. So I'm a very insecure kid, and I'm shy. I'm introverted. I'm not finding many people I can really talk to. And I'm very, very worried about money. So we're talking about late 1960s. The economy is terrible. We all think we're going to be destroyed by nuclear war or environmental destruction. Middle-class people in my neighborhood are losing jobs and nobody talks about it. It's like this incredible shame. And so I'm thinking, boy, I can't count on the economy. I can't count on, the government, anything like that. So it's very important to me to have a skill that I can take anywhere. And there's an old trope about, why are there so many great Jewish violinists? And the answer is supposed to be, well, you can take a violin over the border at midnight if you're, forced out of a country but you can't take a piano. So it's kind of like that. It's also, why you might become a doctor, why you might get some educational skills, something that can't be easily taken away. So for me, it was poker. So I'm an incredibly shy kid and cowardly, but I summoned up the courage to walk into a tavern I'm 14 years old. I go into the basement where I know there's a game. I sit down at the game and I walk out with more money than I came with. And I said, okay, it was no surprise that I could outplay these people. Okay, I just knew, I've thought about poker. I've, studied the probabilities. I know how to play. These are just, random bad players, but they let me walk out. Here's a kid, walk out. They let me
Right,
with the
right.
money. But what I discovered in the next few months, and by the way, this was incredibly, this made me feel enormously better. I said, okay, whatever else happens, the economy crashes, zombie warfare, whether this or that, I can be in a place where I'm friendless and broke, and I can always find a poker game. And if you're, you always get money to play, and you can always get enough money to eat and have a place to sleep. And so I've got this minimum case all set, my guaranteed minimum income for life. But I discovered I got sucked up into a network, and the network had rules, and you learned them. And it was pretty amazing. Back in those days, it was still a national network. I know I don't mean every poker player knew every poker player. I meant every poker game, at every little tavern somewhere had somebody in that game played in a higher level game, and somebody played, and you had to, if you were a consistent winner in a game, you had to move to the higher level game or people wouldn't let you play. And you moved up, and eventually you got to, it isn't like, if you ever read The Cincinnati Kid, it isn't like it goes up to one single person who is the best, who is the man, who's the best poker player in the country. But it goes up, pretty high to where there may be 100 players. And I got up there, right? I did later. It took years. So by the time I'm an undergraduate at Harvard, I'm in this group. And it's pretty heady, right? You can go anywhere in the country and you can slot yourself into this network. And it's a very powerful one. And people did a lot of business in this network. And it's incredibly useful. It broke up. It didn't last by the end of the 70s. It had kind of gone broken up. There's still, sort of pieces of it here and there, but it just is no longer what it was. But this kind of hit me, and this said, okay, this is how I'm going to find networks like this of like-minded people, and we'll help each other and work together. And this is a very powerful idea of how you get things done and how things work. And that's why it fit very naturally to me, in Wall Street. And I said, okay, let's find the other people in Wall Street who think the way I do. Let's work together and see how we can make each other successful.
Which, in your professional career has taken you through some real milestones in the development of the financial markets over the last 40 years. Certainly, mortgage-backed securities were an absolute turning point for the flourishing of the idea of quantitative finance as being the definitive characteristic of the financial markets ever since. And then your involvement with value at risk, which is representative of another theme in the game, I would say. And then your movement through the institutions that you've worked at. And what you've said there has that progression been one of a progression through like-minded people? Are you able to describe it in that way, the way that your professional career developed? Were you able to enjoy it in that way, as you've described, through like-minded people and working through and developing that career?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to say it. So I come to Wall Street. I'm first interested in mortgages, and again, so I find those people in mortgages who are like-minded, and a big thing we did is we shared data, because in those days, if you wanted data, you had to type it in yourself. You had to find, like the Salomon Brothers yield book or old Wall Street journals and type in the data. So we would share data. It was Lou Ranieri at Salomon Brothers who said mortgages are mathematics. And he was the first person to actually look out to hire people who were good at math. So it was extremely mathematical, and we shared our models and we shared our data, and we worked together. We were a minority. We were maybe 1% of the people who were trading mortgages, but we were a network and it made us powerful. We also knew some math, which helped make us powerful. So we weren't rich, we weren't connected, we weren't high ranking, but we all worked together. We all agreed, and everybody else had to come to us. And they didn't come, and say, hey, Aaron, you're so smart, I need your help. But they said, okay, if we use this model, who can take advantage of us, or how can, how's the market going to react, and so on, or what's a good assumption for prepayments that we can use to market this thing. And you were kind of, I don't know, in a position of like a parish priest or something, like you're connected with this organization that's literate. And we're all, we're powerful, we're knights and barons and kings and so on. And you're just a lowly parish priest, but you have a network, you know how to read. And so you have this thing we need. Then the next thing that came along, it wasn't the next thing that came along. The other big area of mathematics was derivatives. And so I get interested in derivatives as well. Then risk management was the third. All of these things I'm working with a community, sort of an informal community people. And by the way, it's not just these things. There's around this time, the cypherpunk Usenet group comes up, and I'm very interested in this cryptography and
Yes.
and the stuff they were doing. So I was involved in these different groups. And I would say I owe most of my success to the membership in these groups. I like to think that I was really smart and clever and lucky and whatever, and this and that, but it was the membership in the group that gave me most of my professional advantage.
That's really interesting. You have taken an interest in crypto assets and blockchain of late. Have you seen that sort of network community existing there?
I was very much in that in the 1970s. So I had a good computer, what was considered at the time to be very good computer science and mathematical education, but I had nothing. Nobody ever taught me anything, either in college or in graduate school, about public key cryptography or about any of these ideas. And there's a Scientific American article from 1979 that, for many people, including me, it was the first time we'd ever heard of it. And it said to me, this is incredibly important. This is going to change it. So I was very interested in it at the time. And I know a lot of or I knew at the time anyway, many of the early cryptography people, but I won't say I lost track of it. I got into other things, this and that. And so, by the time Bitcoin came out, I had not been really I was not completely up to date with all of the digital cash,
Right.
It seemed to me kind of like, there was some obstacle there. There were so many great promising things were introduced and they all fizzled. But Bitcoin didn't fizzle, right? So, it's kind of like, you're trying to light the firework over and over, nothing happens, and suddenly it takes off and, you better run because it's really big. So I got very interested in Bitcoin in 2011, 2012. That's when I started using it. That's when I started mining it. That's when I started making it a core holding in my portfolio. And I've been interested, very interested since. I am not networked in the way I am or the way I was in some other fields. I know some people who are interested, and I've worked on some ideas in it, but I just don't have the kind of focus on it that the real insiders do.
We should really start wrapping up, but there's so many more areas that I'd like to discuss with you that I think I'll probably invite you again towards the end of the year or something like that and cover the other bases. But yes, as I said at the beginning, my motivation in talking about this was to draw the parallels, talk about some of the themes and issues which can be drawn out from thinking about games of chance, thinking about the case of poker, the development of probability and so on, and the intertwinedness of the thinking which leads to development both in terms of gambling games and the modern markets as we know them. It seemed to be something that, through people like you 20 years ago, a couple of decades ago, it was something that was very much talked about in the industry as I felt it as an observer coming into quantitative finance at that time. It was part of the core message when we started the magazine, even if it wasn't specifically stated. But in your observation nowadays, given the way that the shift in terms of, well, certainly where we were 20 years ago in terms of exotic structured products and where we are now in terms of the application of quantitative finance skills, particularly more in risk management and enterprise risk and handling the regulatory calculations of things now, which is a very big shift in terms of what defines a quant these days. Do you think that this kind of discussion or this kind of thinking around games and gambling and the relationship to financial thought is something that needs a refresh again for a current generation of new practitioners?
Well, no, maybe it would be nice. I don't know. I think that the vast majority of people in finance, and particularly in regulatory finance, are not going to be games players by nature, right? They just have a different attitude. And the world needs all kinds of people. You need games players for some things. You don't need them for everything. I think what you need is a solid core of people who are good at games. I mean, who not just like playing them, but are good at them and know the math, understand the math, who form communities, who communicate among themselves, through breaking through institutional barriers, silos, and things like that. And these people are going to be very important. And it's important that, financial market allow them in and attract them and pay them to remain healthy. But I don't think it's, at least in my lifetime, ever going to be something that regulators and CEOs and the general public is really very comfortable with. I think there will be a suspicion that somehow finance shouldn't be a game. Just like people think, justice trials shouldn't be a game, elections shouldn't be games, all of these things should be done soberly and rationally and come up with they don't want a fair trial, a fair election. They don't want fair financial markets. They want accurate ones. They want the best person to be elected, the right verdict in the trial, the right price for everything. They just are not comfortable with the idea that that's impossible, that it can't be done, and that a game is necessary. Not because it gives better results necessarily than you would get from some rational process, but because it's the only way to get everybody to agree. And it is more important that everybody agree on who's the president, everybody agree on whether someone is guilty or not, everyone agree on what the price of oil is, than it is that price or verdict or election decision be correct.
Yes, exactly. And that perfectly leads into the concluding quote that I wanted to use of yours in this interview, actually. Idealists, simple-minded people, and some children want something more. Prices that equal value all the time, courts that dispense justice, and government that is wise and good. I think that they should start working on one of those parallel universes, because I don't think they'll ever be happy here. Words you still stand by, evidently.
Well, yeah, I was a little snarky in that one. I mean, I understand why people want, and I have no problem if they, make Hallmark movies, or rom-coms where that happens. But I don't think it's I don't think it's a safe way to view the world.
Well, Aaron Brown, thank you very much again for your time this evening. And as always, I've really appreciated talking to you and your patience with my questions and the garbled nature of that they come out in. Somehow you've managed to say something pertinent and useful in response to everything I've had to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much.